Hello, welcome back. Today we will complete the module with lecture. This is the lecture 5. So, last lecture of the module. We have been discussing about the nurture, the role of nurture in language acquisition among children, and we have already looked at various factors, various environmental factors starting with child directed speech, BTR, baby talk register. Then we went on to socio cultural environment, various kinds of factors that might be present in the exosystem of the child. So, microsystem as well as exosystem, from BTR to the geographical location, socio-cultural factors, so on. We looked at various factors and how they probably impact. Then we moved on to discussing about the brain, as to how even the brain does not really remain as a mute spectator, it interacts with the social realities, and as a result there is a lot of give and take between the society and the brain. So, thereby we embarked on the idea of social brain or ecological brain, as in how the various kinds of experiences in the outer world as the child is growing up, because when the child is growing up in the beginning for first few years, the brain also grows first couple of years, and then it grows, and as in the very beginning the growth is very fast and eventually it slows down, but there is some amount of growth. So, during that time child is also interacting with the world, and we have seen some of the factors, some of the variables that might be interacting with the brain and then having an impact. So, let us move on with other parameters within this domain of social brain, brain's reaction with the environment. So, the interaction of the brain with environment can be seen in many other domains as well. So, many other aspects of the environment factors in terms of their effect on brain and language development has been also explored. Most importantly, the impact of noise and that of music. These two have been studied in terms of how the environmental noise, or how the if the existence of non-existence of music in the environment can impact the brain and in turn can impact language acquisition. That is what we are interested in. So, this is a three-way kind of an interaction: environment, within environment either noise or music or whatever, how it impacts brain, and then that structural changes in the brain, how it impacts language acquisition, right. So, let us start with noise. Environmental noise. So, increased exposure to excessive noise places a lot of demand on the auditory processing. Anybody who has been to loud music in the places where they play loud music, you will realize this, that you will strain to hear somebody, your friend talking to you. So, this is a very simplistic example, but this need not be always a loud noise. Even the less loud noise than, let us say, a kind of loud music, that also has been studied. So, this kind of difficulty with auditory processing may influence the development of neural circuitry associated with language development. So, that is the crucial connection we are looking at. So, the development of the neural circuitry that is responsible for language development, because we already know, we have already seen that the brain has domains, the brain has areas that are directly connected to language processing, as in language development, acquisition as well as using of language. So, there are certain areas. So, those areas, if they get affected by the external stimuli, then it will have a impact on the language development. So, this process is contingent on being able to hear and parse out phonemes and syllables. Very interesting work in 2015. So, left we will be using certain domains, looking at certain cortical areas which are the main variables in this case, certain main important areas in the brain. So, left interior frontal gyrus, this is how you will write it, and left superior temporal gyrus have been associated with concurrent and future language and reading abilities. So, gyrus is as a large area. When you talk about brain, gyrus and sulcus are the how we look at the brain, the top part of the brain, and however they are quite big areas, and within that also today we know with the state of the art techniques we can look at even smaller ranges, but largely we will focus on these two domains. So, additionally the morphometric qualities like cortical thickness and surface area, these are important variables. in terms of their efficacy for the processes for which they are dedicated. So, the critical cortical thickness and surface area of these regions are associated with environmental factors more broadly. So, with language input specifically. So, cortical thickness is one of the most important variables in terms of its efficacy, and that can be affected by environment, and which in turn will affect language processing. So, that is the idea. So, excessive noise exposure and increased cortical thickness has been found out by many researchers who are looking at this kind of a connection. So, increased noise exposure may place high demand, that we have already seen. The left IFG is responsible for language production and processing as well as phonological processing abilities. Now, decreased cortical thickness is in this region during childhood will reflect in less grey matter formation early in the development. So, if your cortical thickness is decreased, then it will be reflected in less grey matter, and maybe as a result it may be indicative of otherwise altered neurodevelopmental trajectories. So, if you have less grey matter, if the cortical thickness has not is not as per up to the mark, has not developed in the proper way as a result of certain kinds of environmental impact, then it will have a serious impact on the other entire neurodevelopmental trajectory, including language. So, structural differences in language related brain regions have been linked to reading problems, right. For example, one particular group have looked at this differences in the home language environment, including the number of words children hear and the number of conversation they engage in, have been associated with cortical thickness. This was a very this is quite an interesting study actually. So, the home language environment is associated with cortical thickness, and we have just said that cortical thickness is associated with efficacy with which certain neural functions are carried out. So, surface area of these brain regions have been connected to the home language environment. Further, differences in the home language environment have also been associated with the integrity of the underlying white matter tract supporting language abilities and language related brain function of the IFG. So, depending on the environment, home language environment or environment of noise, all of these interact at the structural level, anatomical level of the cortical part of the human brain, and as a result of which the thickness or the grey matter or the white matter changes, and as a result of which it might impact language studies, language development. So, higher everyday noise exposure would be associated with poorer language skills and differences in language related cortical structures. So, there have been studies, for example, socio-economically diverse sample of children were studied, and they used this kind of they used MRI. So, T1 weighted magnetic resonance imaging was used, and they had the surface area and the cortical thickness of the, this is what they measured, surface area and the cortical thickness of the left inferior IFG, that is what we are talking about. IFG and SDG were extracted. So, MRI, and with that they have taken out this information, and using a LENA, that is language environmental analysis, they used the used to measure the levels of exposure to excessive environmental noise over the course of a typical day. Results, what did they find out? Results indicated that children exposed to excessive level of noise exhibited reduced cortical thickness in the left IFG. So, this is what they found, that this study proved that home environmental factors such as environmental noise are associated with neurobiological development related to language development in children. Then we look at music, how music impacts language development. This is again Patricia Kuhl's group. They studied infants with respect to music, the exposure to music. So, they were socialized in an environment playing a variety of music. First, they were all of these studies typically have that kind of a training phase and the test phase. So, in the training phase, in the first phase, familiarization phase, they were socialized with a variety of music while engaged in playing with drums, parents helping them keep the rhythm by tapping the feet. So, a large number of sensory inputs are present in the child's environment. There is music playing, they are playing with drums, at the same time they are tapping their feet to keep the rhythm. So, this way a highly variable social stimulation scenario was created, and a control group had all the similar things except the music in the background. So, one group had continuously various kinds of music playing in the background while they are playing with drums and they are keeping rhythm. The other group, the control group, had everything but except the background music. The test phase, this was the training phase. The test phase used MEG. Again music was played, MEG is the machine that they used. The music was played with slightly mistimed rhythm. The first group of children showed a very high degree of neural activation in a wider area including prefrontal cortex. Prefrontal cortex is often used is the area that is activated for executive function mechanisms and various other higher mental functions. So, that is an area that was found to be activated when they in the test phase when they were when they heard mistimed rhyme. So, there was music played, waltz was played, and there was a mistimed rhyme, and their brain activation showed that they have actually identified it and they are working on it, the brain is working on it. They are also made to listen to a novel language where again they mistimed the rhyme. Here too target group showed higher activation in the region known for attention control. So, attention control, executive mechanisms, cognitive control, these things are controlled by our prefrontal cortex in the brain. The children who were exposed to the background music were doing better in this kind of a task because they had already been, the music was already there. So, now they could find out the mistiming in the rhythm, whether it is a language or it is music. That is what the finding talked about. Thus, experiencing patterned signals, that is what music is, patterned signals help children establish their ability to detect and predict pattern in the world in different domains. This is the finding of this study, very influential study, that if you are the child are socialized with different kinds of patterned signals, this will help them find pattern in the other domains as well. So, even if you have been exposed to music, they can use the same knowledge, the brain can use the same knowledge for finding rhythm in the language as well, that is the idea. So, pattern detection and pattern prediction ability is crucial for optimizing brain resources. So, music has a very important role which is of course out there in the socio-cultural environment, and that has an impact on your brain, the way the brain gets activated. Now, based on all these different kinds of theories, what are the different kinds of theories? We have seen Kuhl's theory of social getting. We have looked at various other kinds of ideas which says that the environment does not play much role, and then the findings that say that environment does play some role. So, because of all of these different kinds of ideas, a new theory has been proposed based on the different kinds of data. It is called the ecological theory of language acquisition. Now, this idea is very interesting. This idea is based on certain kinds of steps. The children are there are different stages. Remember, we talked about another stage wise difference between emergent theory. See, this theory is similar to the emergent theory. Some properties of this theory does correlate with the other one. So, based on the findings from previous studies, the ecological theory of language acquisition was proposed. This theory explains the initial steps of language acquisition process as unintended. So, there are two stages, initial stage and the later stage. In the initial stage, the child is whatever processing the brain does, it is unintended, it is not voluntary, it is involuntary. An inevitable consequence of the infant's multisensory interaction with the environment. This is the most crucial part of the theory, that there is an interaction between all the different kinds of sensory input the child is getting at that time, and as a result of which the child is trying to find some sort of a pattern there, right. The early language acquisition is, I quote, emergent consequence of the multisensorial embodiment of the information available in ecological adult-infant interaction settings. So, when there is an adult, there is a child, there is an interaction happening, there are objects in the environment, there are mappings of the word on the object and so on and so forth. So, there is a multitude of sensory input that the child is exposed to, and that is the time when the structure begins to emerge. That is the idea of the beginning stage, first stage. So, this model proposes a speech interaction scene where correlated external information in terms of sensory dimensions get together. Correlated as in, you have speech, you have sound, the word form, you have the object, you have various other experiences, all of them are working within a what this theory calls a speech interaction scene. So, they collate, they get together sort of. This general sensory processing and memory mechanism worked on the sensory regularities in the typical use of language. So, regularities we talked about statistical patterns, the children figuring out the relative frequencies. So, the same thing in a different way they are talking about. So, the sensory processing, multiple types of general sensory processing as well as the memory mechanisms, they work on the sensory regularities. So, they how regularly the pattern, the mapping are similar and so on. So, in the typical use of language, this is how they map. Then working through the recurrent nature of this co-occurrence, the input stimuli leads to clustering in the representation space. So, interaction space to representation space. So, first they interact, they connect the dots so to say, and then they find out what represents what. So, this word means this particular object, something like that. So, the sensory relationships implicit in these clusters can subsequently be used in cognitive and exploratory processes. So, this is the time when it is a voluntary process to some extent. This is something that the child is doing actively. In the beginning it is unintended, it is just there in the environment, so many things are happening, sensory inputs are taken in and they are mapped onto each other, which is then tracked across contexts based on their co-occurrence, how often these things co-occur, and then they come into a scenario where it is the references are finalized and then the clustering is possible. Subsequently, they are used for in the cognitive and exploratory processes. The infant is not just a passive learner, but an interacting one in this model. So, in this way this theory is similar to what we have seen in the constructivism, where the child interacts with the world and based on the information that they get, based on the mappings that they do, and thereby they learn, and what they learn becomes an input for their later output and so on. So, this is a continuous process. This model also is similarly talking about the same idea. So, this model draws parallel between the original evolution of language and language acquisition by children. While giving the theory, this group, the people who proposed this idea, they say that this child language acquisition and the language evolution, original evolution of language actually have a lot of parallel, though there are differences of course, but there are a lot of parallel. So, they stress an emerging linguistic structure must necessarily rely on the very essence of the speech communication process. So, language emerged as a tool for communication. So, the process is embedded in the social scenario, social setting. So, that has to be taken into consideration. That is the idea, and that might have been also one of the key motivators for in the evolution of language in the first place. So, that is why he draws a parallel, and he says that on many grounds these two things are similar, as a result of which he talks about the link between the acoustic nature of speech and other sensory dimensions. Thereby he theorizes that this might be a domain general process. So, language is not just in the modular reality, but it is a domain general process that is part of the normal socializing practices of the humans. So, in sum, this model starts off with a crude associative process in the beginning, that is the acoustic signal on the referent, that is the association, and then it can rapidly evolve towards an active exploration and crystallization of linguistic regularities. Now, applied to actual language acquisition settings, this model suggests that the infant quickly becomes an active component of the language discovery process. That is how they talk about it. So, starting with association, then using cognitive exploration, eventually they get the, so this is something like a discovery science. They discover what is out there through this kind of a interconnected processes. So, thus in this module we have discussed various perspectives on the possible role of nurture through topics like child directed speech, environment, both natural and cultural, and brain's interaction with this environment, and how these types of interaction have an impact on language learning by children. So, with this we are at the end of this module. Thank you.